President Biden appears to have admitted on video that the Iran deal is dead. At an election rally in Oceanside, California, a woman asked Biden if he would announce that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, is still alive. According to Axios, Biden refused to publicly declare it was done, citing, quote, a lot of reasons, end quote. But he did confirm to the woman that it is dead. This is the first time that he openly expressed a pessimistic view of any way forward to reach a nuclear deal with Tehran. According to correspondent Elizabeth Hagedorn, a State Department spokesperson said Iranians killed the opportunity. What is very much alive is Biden's commitment to ensuring Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon.
Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Trita Parsi, predicted this last year. In an op-ed for MSNBC, he wrote about the Iran nuclear deal talks that took place in Vienna, declaring the deal, quote, lifeless. He went on to say that pretending that a lifeless deal still carries on living is by no means a good option. And he joins us now to unpack all of this. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so break this down for us. You know, what does it mean that this is effectively dead?
Well, reality is that it's obviously been lifeless for some time now. The question has been, would the parties declare it dead or not? Because if you declare it dead, and I think we have to be careful to note that what Biden said is probably not what he should have said or what the American plan was. But if you declare it dead, it means that you have a crisis. And precisely because neither side actually can afford a crisis right now in the midst of everything that is taking place. And when I wrote that article, the war in Ukraine had not even begun yet. So given everything else that is going on, neither side can afford a crisis. So it's better for all sides, at least in the short term, to pretend that this deal is still somewhat salvageable in order to defer the crisis to the future. In the meantime, try to think of what to do when that day comes. So I don't think this was part of the president's talking points to go public with this thing. And this may now create a problem now rather than later for the administration.
Well, Dr. Parsi, help us understand the nature of that crisis. What are the implications of not having not only an Iran nuclear deal, but no kind of path to having one?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm very happy you asked that question because it's also important to note that the administration said about a week or so ago that the diplomacy is not limited to the JCPOA. So even if there is no JCPOA, it does not mean that there is no path towards another diplomatic solution. And I personally think that's going to be extremely difficult given all the circumstances right now and the history. But nevertheless, that's an important statement because it means that the diplomacy has not been exhausted just because the deal is dead. The reason why that's important comes to the second or the first part of your question, which is if diplomacy is declared not only dead, or JCPOA is not just declared dead, but diplomacy is exhausted, well, then the United States is essentially only left with the option of either accepting an Iranian nuclear bomb de facto or going to war. And the last thing the United States needs right now is another military conflict in the Middle East, particularly given everything else that is going on from Taiwan to Ukraine.
How did we get here? Were we just kind of dead in the water for having this kind of agreement once Trump pulled out of it?
No, this deal was absolutely salvageable, and both sides have committed numerous mistakes. And the last biggest mistake was the one that the Iranians committed in September when they didn't accept the offer that was on the table or came back with a counter offer that was so far off that it just made everyone lose hope. But also, I would have to say, the biggest mistake, the first biggest mistake that I think set the stage for everything else, unfortunately, is the mistake of Biden not going back into the deal quickly, if not immediately when he became president, through an executive order, rather than choosing to first spend several weeks consulting with the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the only three countries that actually oppose this deal, and later on seeking a negotiated return rather than just going back in.
That's such a key point.
Yeah, I think it is. And I'm curious, apart from the delay from the Biden administration, and again, you can't stress that enough, there's a whole list at this point of things he could have done by executive order that would have made a meaningful difference to the trajectory of his presidency. But aside from the delay from the Biden administration, what are the particulars? You mentioned a moment ago that there were aspects of the deal that were put on the table that were rejected by Iran. What are the kinds of particulars that are being negotiated over right now?
Well, at this stage, almost everything has been resolved with the exception of a couple of issues. And one of the things the Iranians have sought to have is to, A, have guarantees or assurances that the United States would not quit the deal again. For the Iranians, obviously, would be a major problem if they go back into the deal together with the U.S., or the Iranians are in the deal, but they let the U.S. back into the deal, and then the U.S. quits again. Politically, economically, it would be a major challenge for them. The United States' position has been that there are no real strong assurances that can be provided because the United States, this current government, not only cannot predict what the next president will do, but also does not want to tie that president's hand. I'm not very sympathetic to that argument because it is Donald Trump that did exactly that. He did try, and quite successfully, try to tie the hands of President Biden by putting in poison pills at the very last months of his presidency to make it as difficult as possible to get the United States to be able to come back into the deal. So I think the administration should have been more aggressive in terms of trying to figure out some of those things. But then there were also demands and requests on the Iranian side that the U.S. probably could not meet. But bottom line is, if from the very beginning the U.S. had simply gone back in, yes, some of these issues would have absolutely remained, but the U.S. could then have negotiated those issues from inside the deal. That would have meant that the Iranians would not have advanced their nuclear program as much as they have in the last 20 or so months. And some of the biggest and most difficult and dangerous steps that have been taken have actually been taken under the Biden administration, such as the Iranians going up to 60% enriched uranium.
At a time where the Biden administration, the foreign policy team is so focused on the threat of Russia to Ukraine and more broadly, and the threat of China, Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan, et cetera, we're so focused on those nations and what they mean for the world. And regardless of what you think about that, you might expect the U.S. government might want to get other distractions, just kind of have them settled and worked out, like Iran. But that doesn't seem to be the approach at all. We feel like we can do everything at once, or we can take on every threat, every antagonistic regime in a non-negotiating kind of context.
Well, I think actually the administration's view is that that is exactly what they've tried to do, essentially focus on those other issues and keep this one calm. Their approach, however, or the willingness to spend political capital to actually resolve it and keep it calm have simply not been there in the same way. I think it's important to note that Joe Biden does not see the Iran nuclear deal necessarily as his legacy. It's Obama's legacy. From the very beginning, this issue was not a top priority for the administration. They wanted to keep it calm. They didn't want it to explode. They would like to see it resolved. But the commitment of political capital to get that done was never really there. And part of the reason for that is because Biden had other priorities.
Dr. Parsi, you mentioned that there were other paths forward other than the JCPOA. What do those look like?
I'm not arguing that there are. I'm just saying that even if the JCPOA now fails, it doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to diplomatically resolve this issue. There are other ways. They're extremely difficult. If you thought that it was politically costly for the administration to go back into the JCPOA, you can just imagine how politically costly it will be to restart these negotiations from scratch. The mistrust is deeper now than it was 2 years ago. The circumstances in Iran with the ongoing protests is adding difficulty for the Biden administration to want to sit next to the Iranians, and also raises questions as to whether the government in Iran will remain in place, which is a legitimate question. So all of these different factors means that there may be another diplomatic path. It should be exhausted, but we should have no illusions about the fact that it's actually more difficult than the existing one of the JCPOA.
Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.